Hi everyone and welcome back to Canter Therapy. Today we're diving into a topic that affects every horse owner but is often surrounded by outdated advice and confusion, and that's parasites and worming. We're joined by Professor Caroline Jacobson from Murdoch University, one of Australia's leading experts in parasite management and a co-author of the Australian Equine Internal Parasite Management Guidelines. If you've ever wondered whether you're worming too often, not enough, how resistance develops, what worm egg counts actually tell you, and how to better manage your horse's health, then this episode is packed with practical, evidence-based information you'll be able to put into practice straight away. Before we get started, we'd love your support. Canter Therapy is completely self-funded by Catherine Christensen and myself because we're passionate about sharing good ideas that help horses and people who love them. If you'd like to learn more about our work, explore our educational resources, or grab some Canter Therapy merchandise, please visit cantertherapy.com.au. Every visit, every purchase and share helps us producing these conversations. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. It means you'll never miss an episode, and it really helps more people discover the podcast and supports the work we're doing to share evidence-based ideas throughout the horse world. Now let's get into today's conversation with Professor Caroline Jacobson. Good afternoon, Kat.
Good afternoon, Shelley. Are you excited for this afternoon?
I am. I'm very excited for this afternoon because I got one of the most special people in my life that has come on the podcast. So I'd like to introduce you to Professor Caroline Jacobson. Welcome to the podcast, Caroline. This is going to kill me. I'm just going to say it up front because I call Caroline Kaz and I've got Kat and my brain's not coping with it. Anyway, Caroline, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you a bit about Caroline because I can. Caroline is head of the School of Agriculture at Murdoch University, and got her on the podcast because she also is one of the authors on the Australian Guidelines of Equine Internal Parasite Management, a research paper that was published in January last year. So, yeah, Caroline, we want to pick your brains about worms.
Thank you. I've got a long and passionate history about working with parasites in livestock. So initially in sheep, but we've been running like a horse parasite monitoring service alongside that for probably nearly 20 years now. And so having data, and it was really great to be part of the team that did bring these new guidelines forward. So the guidelines are a first for Australia. They've been done overseas previously, and this was a team or a panel of experts from around Australia, all sorts of different backgrounds, but, like parasitologists with a lot of lab experience, a lot of horse vets, people that had been doing horse work, and also scientists who had done a lot of work with sheep and cattle, which is, look, it's fair to say they were somewhat more advanced along this pathway of evidence-based treatment programs. And we had some international experts on this panel, which was really exciting. So now there are national and international guidelines, and the Australian guidelines, what was really exciting is that they're tailored to Australian conditions.
Yeah.
So that was a new thing. It was really great to be part of.
Yeah. Okay. Though before we get started, we're gonna talk a lot about that. But I think first of all we need to know how the hell you got into parasites and developed a passion for it, because Caroline is a vet, and you were actually going to be an equine vet. I know you had your heart set on that. So tell us how you actually got into getting passionate about parasites.
Oh, look, I mean, that's probably a long story for another day, but probably while I was at uni, I was definitely always going to be a horse vet. I was going to be a horse surgeon, but then I discovered farms and farmers while I was at uni, and when I started working, I was doing mixed practice, still a lot of horses, but really kept my hand in. And my now husband was farming and farming sheep, and I was invited back to do a PhD, which was I had a big, strong parasitology component with sheep. And that was amazing because it was with some of the leading, so I got to work with some of the leading scientists in Australia and probably the world in this concept of sustainable parasite management. So I was really lucky. It wasn't an area that you get a lot of exposure to as a student. And then once I got into it, I just really found my passion for it, right? Because it's, some people will think it sounds nerdy and boring, but particularly when we're working with sheep as well, you can make small changes which affect millions of animals. And so, it's really important, the work that we do, it affects the animal welfare for the animals. And some of the things we'll talk about today with the horses, that becomes apparent as well. And it affects the bottom line. We talk about some, worm diseases, and some of it might not be obvious in the animal, but a 10% drop in, the meat or the wool production is tens of thousands of dollars, to a family. And that's money that family has to reinvest into their farm and into their animals and into their family. So it's something I found really rewarding, is using science and evidence to solve problems and make farming more sustainable, not just for the environment, but for the animals, the animal welfare, and for the farms to be able to reinvest back into their farm and be the best, the best livestock farms that they can be. So it's really exciting. And I'd say if anyone's interested in parasitology, that you'll find, obviously most of it gets done through university, but you'll find parasitologists are some of the greatest scientists to work with, because they're curious and they're clever. And I'm always, I'm never the smartest one in the room when I'm working with parasitologists, and they're just really good at coming at different ways to solve problems. A bit like in horse training, right? There's no one way to attack or solve a wicked problem, and parasites are a wicked problem for animals.
And they're really one that's really practical. That farmers, and it's not something that you go to a vet for or whatever. It's management that's actually done on the farm itself. Or when we bring it back to horses, this is all about horse management, and that's why we're so thrilled to have you on here, because horses and worming is something that there's myths about. There's guidelines about, but then there's all people get concerned about things, or they're worried about resistance, or thinking that
people have some old-fashioned ideas and they're not up to date with current research, and trying to get all of these ideas out there as much as possible is so good for the industry.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a really good point. And a lot of, maybe we'll get to that. A lot of these, it sounds rude, a lot of these out-to-date ideas were right. Do you know what I mean? A lot of these were right. Well, we'll say pre-1985, do you know what I mean? That was the right thing to do. And then in the mid-90s, that was the right thing to do. And, look, I feel people's frustration, right? And it's the same as human diet, right? So suddenly eggs are bad and then eggs are good. And this is, this is one of these classic things when you know better, you do better. So it's, as science has evolved, that's the thing. But, we can talk about this as we go through. A big thing for horse treatment, and we'll talk about, really what are the foundations or what are the fundamentals about how we decide what and when and why we're treating horses. A lot of it's defined by the medications or the treatments you have available. And so, of course, when you get a new family of treatments that behave in a different way, you set your worming programs up around that. But then as the resistance develops, suddenly you've got to flip around. And it took some time to really understand what are the causes of the resistance and then what you can do about it as well. And and again, if you want to get nerdy, a lot of the background to that is because these things happen over years, and it's not something you can run an experiment, and it's not something you can do in a test tube, right? So a lot of the work initially was done on modelling. So these really sophisticated math models. And as the models get better, if that makes sense, as you get more information, the models get better, and then you can predict what's going to happen. But of course, they're still only models. It's like the weather, right? So you've still got to test that those models are working in practice. So, you don't
know how much resistance and stuff you're going to get when you're doing all of those models until you have enough information.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, we can touch on this. And horses are particularly complex for a few reasons. But, when you've got sheep and cattle to some extent, but sheep, you've got a lot more animals, so you've got a lot more data that you can work with, in terms of things like genetics, for instance, right? You can test what the genetic variation in the animal, what impacts that's going to have. In horses, because we've got smaller numbers and they're managed much more as individuals, you've got 1,000 variables, not 1,000, but you've got lots and lots of variables. So it makes it often quite harder to really tease down. But look, to their credit, the Europeans have been doing a lot of really good work around, we'll touch on this today, the targeted treatment strategies. And in North America, that there was the research institutions there were doing it. So the information that we have here, we can touch on that today. There's been a lot of work done recently, just checking that we think that these guidelines hold true for horses, using more sophisticated tests and more sophisticated information. But it's really come down from, taking these concepts, which were originally done in sheep and cattle, where we've got similar sort of environments, and understanding the behaviour of those worms, what we can track to horses, trialling it out, seeing how it works, and then just checking, over 5-10 years, is it behaving as the models would have predicted. So yeah. So it's really interesting. It's no one type of scientist in the same sense that if you've got a horse that's not doing well, it's not going to be only the trainer or the nutritionist or the vet. It's a real team effort to coming to these recommendations. And but again, still putting some nuance in, because not every farm or not every animal will behave like the model, because there's often, to your point, Kat, we've got all of these unknowns as well.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in. And in our show notes, you will find the Australian guidelines that we're going to be referring to. Okay, Caroline, see that? I've got that right. Okay, Caroline, so let's run us through the guidelines, or how you think this information is best presented to people.
Yeah, look, the guidelines, they were originally written, for vets, probably animal health advisors, so that when they are working with their clients, that they've got something that they can refer to that says, well, what do we know? What's the, what evidence do we have? And what are the general approaches that we have to setting up treatment programs for horses? And Kat, to your point about the old-fashioned ideas, it's about the challenges that have occurred with horses are that the worms, the parasites themselves, have started to develop resistance to the treatment, okay? And what this just means, it's that when we use a particular worming medication, is that there'll be some worms that will survive. And that's just a genetic background, right? So, when you bring out a new treatment, it's looking like that it's working 100%. But of course, that's a numbers game, right? So if you've got 100 worms in a horse and you treat it, it'll be, 100% of those worms could be killed. But over time, there's millions and billions of these out there. And what happens is, over time, these ones which have a genetic difference, which allows them to survive that treatment, those numbers of those worms in this case, it builds up, okay? And so the challenge that we've had is to the major worming treatments, or the major families of wormers that we have, is that the worms have built up resistance. And again, it's not really surprising. It's for one of the big drivers of that was the frequency that wormers get used in horses, to your point, Kat, and that was this understanding that a lot of people would have grown up with, that you treat your horse every 6 to 8 weeks for worms, okay? And so every time you use that wormer, you are training effectively. You're selecting those worms to be resistant. And it's not that a worm becomes not resistant and then it becomes resistant, but what happens is, because you're killing all of the, what we call the susceptible worms, it's the resistant ones that survive in the horse, and then they breed, okay? So fun fact, most of the parasites that we talk about with horses have male and female worms, and they meet in the horse.
And they reproduce, and we only have one's left.
So one of the first challenges that we have is that the more often that you use a treatment, okay? You're effectively training that worm population and selecting for the resistant worms. And so what happens is they build up over time. And so one of the first foundations of the recommendations is how can we reduce the number of treatments or the frequency that horses are treated with, but importantly, without putting those horses at risk of disease, okay? And so that's got to be the number one concern, or the number one goal of the treatment, is that we're keeping worms to a manageable level where we're unlikely to see worm-related disease in the horses. The second sort of challenge is, well, what are the things that we can do around that to reduce the amount of treatments that we need? And again, that the principle there is the less treatments that we use, the more sustainable it is, because the worms have seen those treatments less, okay? And so, you know, what we're hoping is that those treatments will remain good and effective on our farm, 10, 15, 20 years down the track. So that's our second key principle. And then that's where these concepts come in, and I know it was something that you're keen to talk about today, is around the monitoring and the worm egg counts, is how do we use the worm egg counts, and what information does it give us? And again, we can touch on that, because the worm egg counts are important for telling us when we need to worm, but they're also important for telling us how our treatments are working. So it's giving us information about the horses, but also about the treatments that we're using.
Yeah, it's just one, but with the worm egg counts, definitely need to talk about that. But do worm egg counts show all worms that are problematic in the horse?
That's a great question. So I think we spend a lot of time encouraging people to use worm egg counts. And I tell you, I've done thousands of them, and an egg count always gives you better information than no egg counts, okay? But it's important to really understand what it's telling us. So at its most simple, okay, what an egg count is, it's just counting the eggs in a sample of manure. So we collect, a sample fresh manure from the horse. A small amount of that gets sent to the laboratory. We dilute it in like a sugar or a salt solution. And what that does is it allows the eggs to float up to the top, okay? So a bit like us floating in the salty, is it the Dead Sea, the Red Sea? Like we float on the top. So the eggs float up to the top, and then we can count them, okay? And again, we can talk about this later, but we can count them with a microscope. Now we can, manually, so a person looking down the microscope and counting the eggs in the sample. Now there's some tools which automate that, okay? So it might use a camera or, a counting thing to do it, but it's the same principle. So it's a count of the eggs, okay? And so what that tells us is in that day, in that pile of manure, that's effectively a reflection of the adult female worms that are in the horse that were producing eggs, right? So that makes sense. Yep.
So you can correlate it to a potential level of worm burden. That's the number of worms in the animal. Yes or no?
This is the complicated thing. It will correlate loosely to the adult worms in the horse. Yes. And so that's the point, right? So if you can imagine, think of a chicken farm, right? If you were looking at counting the number of eggs out, that loosely tells you how many adult female chickens you have. What it doesn't tell you is how many day-old chicks and the immature ones might be on the farm, right? So there could be a few, there could be none, there could be a lot, right? And this is one of the challenges, is that some of the more dangerous stages of worms for some horses are actually those immature ones. Yeah. So it's why when we look at the egg counts and we compare that to the total number of worms in the horse, and unfortunately the only way to do that is with a post-mortem exam, right? So which is why it's very rarely done. So it's why they don't match very well. So their egg counts tells us how many eggs the horse is putting out on a given day, right? Yeah. So what it doesn't tell us is how many worms are in the horse. So as a one-off sample, right, is if we've got a sick horse or a horse that we're not really sure about, yes, the egg count's good, and if the egg count's high, that's telling. But if the egg count's low, it doesn't rule out worms being part of the problem.
It doesn't give you all the information.
Yeah. And this is one of the things, and sometimes people might talk to the vet and the vet says, it doesn't really tell us much. And so, you interpret that as thinking it's not a good test. And it's not a good test to see if there's a lot of immature worms in the horse. But what it is useful for is telling us how much is that horse contributing to the worm eggs that are going to be on the paddock and are going to be infecting our horse in 2, 3, 5 weeks' time, okay? So that's what it's telling us about, is about the infection potential. The other thing it's helpful for, to your point, Shelley, is if I do an egg count today on my horse and it's 700 eggs per gram, okay? So it tells us on that day, that's how much is putting it out. I treat my horse, I retest it in 2 weeks. If the egg count's down, what it tells me is that treatment's worked well against those adult worms at that time. And if the egg count, 2 weeks later is still 500, what it's telling me is, that treatment now is not working well against the adult worms. So that's, again, and going back to that point, what the egg counts tell us about, it tells us something about the horse and its infection potential. It tells us something about the treatment efficacy, and efficacy is just another word for effectiveness, where how well those treatments are working. But again, to that point, and without wanting to overcomplicate it, the egg count that we do 2 weeks after the treatment tells us how well it's working against those adult female worms. But what we're really interested in is how long it takes for the egg counts to build back up to their previous level. And the reason that that's important is when the medications or the drugs, we like as vets we call them drugs, but it's the worming treatments that we use. When the worms are really resistant, it's obvious, okay? So 2 weeks after the treatment, there's still a lot of adults left, and we know that it's not working. But that happens quite far down the track. And remember before we talked about how the resistance develops because the worms with the genes that allow them to survive. So it takes a long time for those adult, for us to see this adult treatment failure. But what will happen earlier is that the treatments stop working like they used to against the immature worms in the horse. And what will happen is the treatment, when we treat the horse, it'll knock out most of the adult worms and less of the immature worms. But what it means is it takes less time for them to rebound and reestablish and then become adults and start producing the eggs again. So what we see, and this is what we're seeing in Australia now, is that the treatments that used to work, and we would expect that the egg counts would stay low or zero for 8 weeks, or in the case of a drug like moxidectin, it used to be 12 to 14 weeks. What we're seeing is much shorter egg reappearance periods, right?
Okay.
And so that can be an indication on a given farm that we've got emerging resistance, okay? So if you just do only the 2-week test, you might think everything's hunky-dory. But what we do is when we know that we're getting these shortening of the egg reappearance periods, we know that if we just go along, keep using lots of treatments, that in less time, so it might be a matter of 2, 3, 5 years down the track, suddenly we're going to start seeing total failure. So again, that's something that we tend to do in a much more experimental or scientific setting, because doing the egg counts on a weekly basis is tricky and expensive, and it's not necessarily something you would do with one horse on your property. But if you're a stud with lots of young stock, that would be something that we would encourage people to do periodically, just to check that the treatments are working how we expect them to work. And, are we sort of red light, green light, orange light in terms of resistance status? So we would say that red light is when we're starting to see the declining efficiency or efficacy at that 2-week test. The orange light is when we're seeing these much shorter protection periods, and the green light is when they're, when they were working as we would expect when the drugs were released.
Yeah. And so is this why this kind of thing that can happen with developing resistance, is this why we have this kind of guideline for this, this cycling of different drugs? Is this why this exists?
Yeah, look, that's the rotations are a really good question. So again, going back to the point was what people learn. Originally we all wormed all of our horses every 6 to 8 weeks, or every 8 weeks, and then over time it was really encouraged that you would rotate between treatments. And again, people that think that now didn't make that up. That was actually recommended. And if we go back to particularly pre-1990s, right?
Yeah.
Is it made sense to rotate between treatments because what happened, let's say in the olden days, is not all of the treatments treated all of the worms. And so the idea is that you would do them you would use drug A one time and then you would use drug B the next time. And the idea is that, drug B would pick up the ones that drug A missed, right? As we got the broader spectrum treatments through, and again,
and broad spectrum, what does that mean?
Sorry, yeah, that's a good point. The treatments which would treat more of the worms, okay? So more of the worm families, right? So as those treatments became available, that became less necessary, let's say. And because they were cheap and safe and all of these things, people, we were tending to use the treatments. And then the next recommendation for horses was, I guess, what we would call a slow rotation, where you would use family A for 12 months and then you would change to family B. And the thought was that, again, going back to those genetics of the worms, that if, you used family A of the treatments for 12 months, right, and then they built up resistance, the thought or the logic was that switching to family B would kill those worms, provided that they didn't have the gene for both. Right? which one was, not, we know now, that's not always the right assumption. The other thing that happened is that you can kind of end up selecting for multi-drug resistance. And
you got a problem.
And again, it's only modelling. So it was actually mathematical modelling that said, hey, this is probably not the right thing to do. And it took quite some time for people and I say this in the science community, to sort of really believe that modelling, okay? And again, that was originally done, my understanding, and look, I apologise, no one write to Shelley and Kat and complain if I've got this wrong, but my understanding at the time was that modelling initially came out in sheep, okay? And so sheep, you can imagine they're grazing pasture, and so this similar principle, but they were much further down the resistance track at the time. And the modelling was done showing that you're much better using more effective drugs than you are doing these rotations. And so it took some time for this to come in horses. And then that modelling was done more recently in horses to confirm that, yes, So, look, again, people weren't imagining that. So, probably even 10, 15 years ago, there was still education that was coming out saying you should rotate your treatments.
Yeah, but now it's...
Yeah, the thought now is that you test your treatments on your farm, to your point, Kat. So you'll do your egg counts before, your egg counts after, and you use the best treatments that you have. And if you look, and again, it's controversial, but again, the work was originally done in other livestock, but the thought was that if you use combinations of treatments at the same time, okay, and in Australia we have more of those available than they do in other parts of the world. Yeah. So, it might be like abamectin and marantal, okay? So the thought is that using those at the same time, if you've got a worm, so I'm a worm and I've got a gene to abamectin, you would hope that I don't have the gene for marantal resistance, so you're more likely to knock me out. And so that's the current understanding, is that using the most effective treatments and reducing the treatment frequency is the thing that will preserve that treatment the longest. But again, it's one of it's hard. I don't like to think of them as a myth, because there's a lot of myths out there that are wacky and never had any basis in science. But like I said, 20 years ago, this was the best bet with the best evidence that they had at the time. So that's why that still persists.
So let's recap.
Yes.
So let's recap where we're up to. So what we want to do, we target parasites in the worms because we want to reduce the risk of having parasites damage the internal digestive tract or other organs of the horse, because they can go out everywhere depending on the actual parasites.
The worm. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, look, we'll recap, but look, let's come back then is to talk about how understanding the worms that we have in our area, our region, and our horse age group is the thing that really controls
that's quite significant.
Our goals.
So recap is our aim is to reduce the risk of parasitic disease. And what we do is that we use a combination of understanding the medication, research first of all to understand. We also want to reduce the use of drug as well, but we want it to be effective. So it's utilizing through research. What we've discovered is by looking at worm egg counts, and we can actually have a look at individual drug preparations and how effective they are if there's resistance building, and then have a process or an understanding of, what actual drugs to use. So not using the rotation anymore, we just use combination products that have more than one drug. That reduces our risk of the parasites having resistance, like being resistant to it. But let's just circle back to reducing the risk of parasitic disease and what can happen to
what parasites do we have?
Yeah, what parasites do we have and what do they do?
I guess another qualifier, and I guess parasitologists love the qualifiers, is that we still do recommend the rotations, but it's when you've got everything else right. Does that make sense? So I guess again, my analogy being a horse person, once you've got the horse's feet right and the diet right and the training right, that's when you worry about your saddle blanket, right? So I think rotation's still in the mix, but it's much further down, much further down the track. So look, again, this is probably where some of the thought processes have changed with horse parasite control, whereas before it was about really high clearance rates, with the treatments we would use. We'd want 100% clearance and, ideally we were controlling all of the worms. I think over time, particularly as there's been more work done looking at the horses and the parasites themselves, their epidemiology, is it's become apparent probably two things. One is that it's unreasonable to eliminate all worms. Two, it's probably unnecessary to eliminate all worms. And three, there's an element of training the horse's immune system, right, which will give it this long-term robustness. So we're really balancing this guideline by, I guess, reducing the worms to a level that we know that the horses can cope well with them. And appreciating the horse's immune system, like anything, is subject to external stresses and all of
that
these
become
things.
aging or unwell or super stressed.
But we do have this goal, and this is particularly with the small strongyles. So again, we talk about families of worms. We've got the strongyle family of worms, and they're grouped together because, or genetically, they're sort of related and they behave similar. So we've got a whole heap of different species, but they all behave similar in that the eggs are passed in the manure. They go through a series of molt. This is the worms. The worms emerge from the eggs. They go through a series of molts, if that makes sense, where they shed their skin, if that makes sense, and then they get bigger and bigger. And when they get to the third stage, they're infectious to the horse. And
then they can be eaten.
And that's important because the time that it takes them to do that is really dependent on the environment, the weather and the humidity and all of these things.
And how much was present in the paddock.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then once they're in the horse, they spend most of their time in the intestine or the lining of the intestine. So again, there's large strongyles and small strongyles. And again, pre-1980s, the large strongyles were the ones that everyone worried about because, to your point, Shelley, the immature worms for the large strongyles go through this migration. So they effectively, the horse swallows the larvae then migrate. But the trouble with the migration, they go on this grand tour sort of through the horse. but the danger of that is that part of that migration goes through the blood vessels that supply the blood to the intestines. And the problem with that, you can imagine if you've got a very fine blood vessel and you've got a worm crawling through it and it damages the lining of the blood vessel, the body wants to heal that by forming a clot, okay? And then you've got a worm and a clot. And then if that clot and the worm kind of blocks off the flow of blood, and that kills off, or blocks off the blood flow to the intestine, it can cause death of that part of the intestine. And for a long time, up until the 1980s, that was a major cause of death in horses, because often once it gets to that point, you can only fix it with surgery by cutting out cutting out very, very serious, very high mortality rates. And so that was the principle under which we treated horses, right? We treated them every 6 weeks because we wanted to get rid of those large strongyles. In the 1980s, a medication, a worming treatment came out called ivermectin. And it revolutionised the control of horseworms because, well, one, they were very susceptible to the ivermectin, the worms, but two, because these large strongyles go through, again, this grand tour, it takes about 6 months. It actually takes 6 months for the immature worm to go through, do its tour and end up as the adult worm in the gut. And they're very susceptible to the ivermectin in that time. So what it meant was you can treat horses, as little as 2 or 3 times a year, and you can almost eradicate eradicate the large strongyles on the farms. And so, that's a good thing. What we now know, though, is that their cousins, the small strongyles, they don't go on this long migration. What they do, okay, so the immature worm, the horse swallows it, the immature worm is in the intestine. They still spend time, okay, but what they do is they wall themselves off in a little cyst in the wall of the intestine. So it's effectively they make their own little bubble in the lining of the intestine, and they sit there, okay, and they might sit there for days, okay, or they might sit there for months, or longer, okay, like really long time. And the trouble is, it's while they're in there that they're effectively hibernating. So it's not hibernating in the ecological sense in that it's winter and you're a bear, but it's what we call arrested development. So they arrest their development. Anyway, it's like the TV show but different. But they sit in the cyst and they slow down their metabolism when they're in effective. That's why we call it hibernation, right? So they slow down their metabolism. But of course, if they're sleeping and they're not metabolizing, they're also not metabolizing the medications. And that's how most of our worming treatments work, right? Is it blocks something that they're doing when they're growing or they're using their energy or whatever. So if they're not doing the processes that the medication, they don't get treated. And so the thing is, it's because that can happen, you can't really eradicate these worms because we don't have treatments that will take out all of them, okay? And so, again, our plan now is really for adult horses is really centred around those small strongyles. And the reason is, that the irony is they don't, most of the time, they don't cause a lot of disease. Where they can cause disease, these small strongyles, is when they build up in large numbers in these cysts.
Blocking off areas.
And we don't really understand it. Sheep have a parasite that does a similar thing, for them it's in the stomach. So they go through this arrested development and then they can emerge, and we don't really understand always what the trigger is. Ironically, one of the triggers is probably treating the animals. So when we take out the adults, the immature worms get this sense that, it's time to replenish the population, and so some of them will come out. But again, we don't know what it is, and if you get a lot of these cysts in the wall and they all burst out at the same time, the horses can become really sick, like really, really sick. And so again, part of our goal with the treatment is to keep it to manageable levels so that, and again, back to that point, is really managing the worms that they're ingesting from the pasture so that these immature ones don't build up in the lining of the gut. But again, we don't need to get the adult counts down to 0 for 2 reasons. One, we don't have an accurate test which tells us how many are in the gut at a given time, but there's just no benefit. There's no additional benefit from keeping the egg counts at 0 all the time. But the flip side is our foals. So our foals and our very young horses, or horses that have never been exposed to them, one of the other families of worms, we call them the ascarids. And in horses, the genus is Parascaris, okay? And these are the worms that people might have seen. They're big, okay? They look like a bit of spaghetti, but they're big. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? They might be, 6 inches or longer. They're white, okay? And they're big and thick and white. Yeah. And look, if you're a horse, the good thing about those worms is you will develop an immunity to them relatively quickly. The downside is if you're a foal, they're big, right? And so if you get big numbers of these worms in the gut, they can actually cause blockages. And so, again, they can cause colic, and often surgical colic in foals and weanings that we have to worry about. The other drama with the Parascaris worms, again, the horse will swallow the egg, and again, the worm goes on this grand tour, and this one goes through the gut but then bursts, and it goes through the liver and the lungs and then back to the gut. It takes months, right? But the danger is when it does that, I mean, they're small, but each time they do that, they form a little bit of scarring. And again, you've got performance horses, you don't want that level of scarring. And again, when they're crawling through the lungs, the lungs recognise that as something foreign, right? So they're setting up inflammation and things. Yeah. So again, that's a big one that we worry about with foals. And so our treatments with foals are really centred around preventing those worms.
Yeah, okay. Does the foal get any immunity from its mother? These worms?
Yeah, probably, but short-lasting, right? Because it would get some of these maternal antibodies, but because worms are big, so look, those maternal antibodies are good for things like viruses or, small bacterial infections but the trouble is the worms, because they need a combination of immunity that's like antibodies so that you can attack them, but there's also things that happen in the mucus of the gut, and there's things that happen at multiple levels that, it does help, but what happens is it declines very quickly. Yeah.
So they really need that treatment's important for foals for those particular
especially in the first 12 months. So and again, it's why we go back to these principles, and again, if anyone's really interested, and particularly people with breeding operations, is that there's never any recommendation that we skip treatments for foals, okay? Yeah. Foals and weanlings. So while we say that our basis or one of the goals for our treatment program is to use less treatments, that's in adult horses, okay? Yeah. And so the goal is that we use less treatments in the adult horses, the horses that are 5 and older. And the goal there is that we can keep the treatments working as long as that we can, so we can keep using them, 4 or 6 times a year as we need to. Do you know what I mean? In the younger horses in those high-risk situations. So
can I ask you about another couple of worms? I might be pushing you along. But what about tapeworms and bots?
Yeah, really good question. And Kat, back to your I can't remember, maybe it was Shelley, but back to your point about the worm egg counts and what did they tell us?
Yes.
One of the problems with worm egg counts is it doesn't tell us anything about occasionally we'll see tapeworm segments, and that says that the horse has some tapeworms, but if we don't see the tapeworm segments, we can't say with confidence whether they're there or not. So tapeworms, they don't produce eggs like the other worms. They're a bit trickier. And bots are the other one. So because bots, they're not a worm, they're a fly. They're a fly larvae that sort of sets up residence. So again, when we go back to the guidelines, so the guidelines, although they're based around using egg counts and trying to spare treatments by not treating the horses with the low egg counts, we still have a recommendation that even adult horses in that 5 years and older group will still have a treatment at least once a year. And the focus for that is the bots, clearing out any tapeworms. And then there's some other worms which can be important in some areas or some environments.
Yeah.
So Habronema, and so these are the ones that cause summer sores, onchocerca, things like that. So again, although the guidelines are guidelines, they still say that very specifically that we still keep some treatments in for all horses, okay? And that's for those worms that we don't know much about, or the parasites we don't know much about. And in some areas, although we've said one treatment a year, if you're in, say, an area that has a much higher risk, or we know that there's been tapeworm build-up in that environment, we'd probably recommend more frequent treatments. So, yeah. Tapeworms are interesting in that, again, the advice has chopped and changed. We've been lucky in Australia in that we've had treatments for quite a long time, which include the tapewormers, if that makes sense. And the most recent studies have said that they're probably not that frequent. So the trouble is, again, there's no perfect test for them. So where tapeworms can cause problems, there was some work done quite a long time ago now that thought that it caused a condition called intersusception, or it was more common in horses that had intersusception with these tapeworms. And so that's where the intestine sort of folds over on itself. But again, it's not super common. And again, it's one of these things that, again, we would encourage people to work through the guidelines with their vet. And if that was a concern in your area, or if you'd had horses with like spasmodic colic or these intersusceptions, we'd probably say, look, let's assume that tapeworms could be part of it, and we would have a higher treatment frequency until we knew otherwise, if that makes sense. So
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's really highlighting it's a really important management thing for horse owners to understand. Because it does have ramifications. There can be variations and differences depending on where you live or how many animals you have or what type of horses you have. You've got young horses, old horses, etc. So we've got to manage them. That's important. Everyone's got to get their head around it. We've learned, and you've told us about the importance of worm egg counts and what it can and can't do, but also how it has a role and how we do have drugs. Drugs and medications, wormers, and they're kind of something we've got to get our head around. Now, there's got to be other things we can do as well, because I suppose the horses are consuming the worms, so surely we can do something about that. So what other measures are there that's recommended that is effective to actually reduce the number of worms horses are consuming?
Yeah, look, that's really spot on. And again, the cornerstone of any good parasite program is this concept. And again, you can look at it in all different types of animals, but they call it integrated parasite management, okay? So IPM. And the integration is using, I guess, chemical or medications, but other things you can do, okay? And probably what I would say is the first thing you need to do to really understand what is appropriate, integrated parasite management on your property is having an appreciation that at any given time, the parasites on your property, okay, will be in two places. There'll be the ones that are in the horse and there'll be the ones that are on the pasture.
Yeah.
And for horses, the next thing that we think about is that there are the eggs that are on the pasture, and those are the ones that probably the horse is going to pick up and ingest and is the next generation. But then we've also got the eggs that are in the manure. And the thing with horse manure is it's good at a lot of things. And one of the things it's particularly good at is making a safe environment that the eggs can survive in much longer than they would out in the wild, okay? Yeah. And so, and again, without overcomplicating it, if you're an egg with a little worm inside, or if you're the little larvae of the worm that's just emerged from the egg, you can survive longer when it is not too hot, okay, and not too dry. And the time that it takes you to grow and develop into your infectious stage where you're ready to infect a horse, when it's warmer, okay, you will grow quicker. Like like a lizard, right? They move more when it's warm. So they'll develop quicker when it's warmer, but they'll live less long, okay? So one of the key things that we have is that these worms will survive much longer in the manure than they will out on the pasture, because out on the pasture, they'll get dried out very quickly, okay? So one of the things that we can do, we talk about this, is, well, when do you make the decision about picking up manure, okay? Or if you pick up your, if you're on small paddocks, cleaning them and harrowing and all of these things. And again, one thing I'd say as a person that works in agriculture is, look, we have recommendations for horses, but one of the things that we have to balance out is how you're managing your pastures, right? Because you've got your agronomy and what you need to do to look after your soils and your pastures. But what I'll talk about is what are some of the things that happen with the horse parasites, okay? So the first thing is, well, if we're picking up and removing those manure piles, one thing that we're doing is we're taking away that next generation. Yeah. And if we're taking them out of the paddock where the horses can eat it, composting it, and ideally, when our compost gets hot, so about 60 degrees, that almost sterilises out those eggs, right? Yeah. So the first thing we can do is remove the manure, take it away and either rest it or heat it up, and then and then it can go back out. We can spread it back out, and, it can be safe. But one of the first things when we talk about picking up the manure is, how often does that need to happen?
Yes.
And again, recognising that will depend on where you are. So Canberra versus, I don't know,
Perth,
Southeast Queensland versus Perth versus Western Victoria, right? Tassie.
Yeah.
So they're all going to be quite different. But in general, the hotter and drier it is, the shorter, do you know what I mean? The rest period you need to clean your pastures. And the cooler and the wetter it is, the longer it is. So in summer, summer in Perth in February, it might be sort of 3-4 weeks, or maybe even less, do you know what I mean, realistically, the worms survive. So if you're picking up the manure every sort of twice a week, you're picking up, do you know what I mean? You're removing them, you're removing most of the eggs, and any that come out aren't going to survive. So probably in winter, it's because they last much longer, it becomes more critical, okay? So it's probably the recommendations in Australia are for that to be the main really effective. It probably needs to be as often as probably 2, maybe 3 times a week. But again, acknowledging that in some areas, probably once a week, once a fortnight might be okay at some times of the year. And of course, that's not always practical, okay? The second question that we have is around resting the paddocks, and that comes to that same point, okay? And one of the challenges that we have is that often, particularly in those cool, wet months, not when it's freezing, not when we've got a frost, but when it's those cool, mild months, in Western Australia, it might be as long as 6 months to really clean those paddocks, and most of us don't have that luxury or that, So that's why we say, look, resting paddocks when you can, but really, if you're relying on that, having that frequent manure removal. The third question is about spreading the manure.
Yes, how effective is that?
Yeah. So this is the you give and you take. So by harrowing and spreading out the manure, you're breaking up the manure balls. And so what you're doing is basically making it so that the larvae will be exposed to the weather. They should die quicker, right? The flip side is what happens is, because horses have these grazing patterns, and they've got what we call the lawns, which are the area that they like to graze, and the roughs, where they're pooping and urine and things. The trouble is when you're harrowing, is you end up spreading the worms over a much bigger period, and the horses are more likely to eat them. So it can actually make the problem worse. So where harrowing is good is where you can harrow and then rest the paddocks, okay? And how long you need to rest them. In winter, it's going to be months, okay? In summer, it's probably going to be a much shorter period. But again, in somewhere like a Perth or big chunks of the area, the hot weather is like the last time that you want to be harrowing your paddocks, because you don't want to be pressuring.
You'll sink.
Do you know what I mean? Your pasture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So again, where do we recommend it? Well, where we know that the egg counts are at a manageable level. So what we wouldn't want to do is harrow a really heavily contaminated paddock. And if we did, we'd want to be resting it for as long as we could before we put the horses back in there. So again, tricky recommendation. And it's one that we would balance it out on average, right? Which is why the egg counts are so important, because doing those routine egg counts every year, you can sort of see, oh, have I done something 3 months ago? And I can detect that the worms are building up in the horses before the wheels fall off, if that makes sense. So.
Sorry, I get so excited about this, Caroline. I'm like sitting up, put my hand up, and I was like, I feel like I need to put my hand up. I have another class. So what about from like looking at worms from like a yearly sort of cycle thing? Do you think you could break the cycle enough in summer with the worms to get through to winter? Does that make sense? Like if you're harrowing,
yes,
they don't need to be spelled as long in summer, can we break the cycle and then it not be as big an issue in winter when we can't manage the manure in the same way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you've maintained low egg counts in the horses over the summer, what it does is it means you're going into the next winter with less worms, which are ready to do their things. So it's it was never really a thing in horses, but certainly in sheep, because if you've got to treat 5,000 sheep, you can't be doing that every 6 weeks, right? And so in somewhere like Perth, where you've got, hot, dry summer, what we would do in Western Australia is we would treat all of the sheep at the start of summer. And the idea is that then they would go through the whole summer with no worms, do you know what I mean? And then they'd go into the next year with less worms. And it worked. It worked really, really well. But what it also did was it set up beautifully. It effectively selected for resistance. And so what we found was resistance developed quicker in Western Australia and parts of South Africa than in other parts of the world. So although we had very, very effective worm control, again, I hope your listeners are a little bit nerdy. So effectively what we learned from that experience was this concept, the scientific word for this is refugia, okay? And refugia is Latin, and it just means like a refuge. So in your case, Kat, so if you've got a property, you've got 3 horses, okay, and you're going into, a hot, dry summer in parts of the world, or maybe a really cold, frozen winter, do you know what I mean, in other parts.
Yeah.
So if you go into that, let's say that worm unfriendly period, and then we treat the horses at that time. Now, again, if we go back, and I alluded to this earlier, is this concept of understanding that the worms on your property are on 2 places. They're in the horse and they're in the paddock, okay?
Yeah.
So if we're going to use the season, what we're going to kill with the season are all the ones in the paddock, okay? So we can knock those out. And if we do that very effectively with hot and dry or freezing conditions, suddenly the only meaningful worms that we have on the property are in the horse.
That are resistant to the drugs.
Yeah. So if we then treat the horse at that time, right, then what happens is they go into the following year, which to your point around the yearly cycle, is that they then go in with mostly resistant worms. And then those worms go out onto the pasture, and then over time they build up. So this concept of refugia is about having some worms which are in refuge, if that makes sense. And in that context, they're in refuge from the treatment or the medication. Okay. So I say that, about the horse manure, it's why we've actually had horse worming, or the medications for horses have probably persisted longer than they did in, say, sheep, okay, in Western Australia. And the reason is that those manure piles actually formed a source of refuge where we had some of those resistant worms. Yeah. And if they survive, what happens is the horse then picks those up and it dilutes them in the horse. So when they're breeding, the next generation of worms have more of those susceptible genes as well, which is really interesting. So look, absolutely. And this is, again, where we talk about your worming plan, okay, is understanding when have you got a time of year where the conditions are not favourable for the worms, and how can you manipulate that, okay? So what you might want to do is treat the horses going into that, okay? But again, this concept that if we've got the egg counts for the horses, that we can group those horses into low, medium or high. What we might do is leave some of the adult horses, so the horses that are probably 5 and older with the low egg counts. So egg counts, well, less than 200. We might, in some areas, we might say less than 500. And then we'll let them go through that hot, dry period or that freezing period, knowing that they're not going to get disease. Do you know what I mean? They're going to be safe. We can deal with them at the other end. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In the following year, because they're not they're not causing problems on the paddock. And then we would tend to treat those, in the following year on the cycle. And that based on the modelling that we've done and what we see in practice, that tends to allow our treatments to stay effective for longer, so that they're working in those high-risk horses. So the pregnant mares, the foals and the weanlings, the 1 and 2 year old horses as well. It's really good. That's a really good concept.
Feel like I remember this somewhere from when I was at uni, but the worms that aren't resistant, their genetics seems to be a little stronger than the resistant worms. So if they were to breed, if they were in competition, the ones that weren't resistant are generally going to be
susceptible. Yeah, there's some thought about that. And, look, high level, and it's honestly, you'd need a much cleverer guess than I. There's some question about whether you can revert. John May, so if you stop using a treatment for long enough, do they revert? The trouble is, you can do that with 30,000 sheep, right, on a property, because you could probably accept a little bit of loss. If it's your
pride and joy horse, maybe not so much.
Yeah, and the other thing is you often don't have enough horses with the high egg counts, so we don't really know. I don't think we know anything about reversion in horses, but it's a really interesting question about what could we do, or could we bring some of the old medications back? And again, look, it's not my area, but it's unlikely. We're not going to get another treatment for horses in the next few years, okay? And it's expensive, okay, to bring treatments online. I don't think we've had a new family of drugs in horses for, really since the 80s. A lot of the medications we have are variants of ivermectin. There's been 2 new families which have been released for sheep and cattle, or sheep at least, but they're not been released for horses, and for a variety of reasons, that the parasites, safety, all of these things. So it's why it's really important that if you want to be having horses for the next 20 years, is that you do take this seriously, and it's why it's worth having a chat with someone in your area that really understands how to implement these recommendations in your area. Sit down with you and come up with a bit of a 5-year plan that you can work through. Yeah.
Right. Kaz, now do you think there's anything else we should know about from the guidelines that's important?
There's so many more questions. I think we're going to have her back, Shelley.
Oh, no, well, that's all right. I'm just...
look, I've got some colleagues which are really great. But look, I think the first one is the principles of understanding that, look, and I would say this is, where it goes wrong is people who hear the first part of the message, that we've got to use the treatments less, right? So they say that we've got to use the treatments less. So I'll treat my horses less often, and then the wheels fall off. And when I was doing the egg counting service, you'd see this from time to time, okay? So yes, we recommend less treatments, but it's when we have the information that allows us to do that. So that's the egg counts, the monitoring, and we only do it in the horses where we've got the egg counts to know that it's okay, and 2, it's only really going to be happening in those adult horses, so probably 5 years and older, but not elderly, not in our Cushingoid horses, not in our horses which are recovering from colic surgery and all of these sort of things. So it's a qualified message. The second thing I would say is that the egg counts give you great information, but they give you great information when you're taking them over a long period of time, because it doesn't give you, the one-off doesn't tell you if that horse has lots of worms. Do you know what I mean? And I would say the big thing is if you've got a horse that's not picking up weight, that's not quite, its coat's not great, it's not, it's just not thriving, right? It's like, by all means, we would do the worms and we would do the worming treatment, but I would 100% in my experience, in veterinary practice, is at the same time we'd be going through the list, okay? So teeth, ulcers, sand if you're in a sandy area, and the diet. Because often worms are part of the problem, and when horses are stressed and they've got other things going on, right, their immunity's down and then the worms build up. But equally, when they're fighting off the worms, that's when they've got that background stress, and that's when we're going to get ulcers and all of these other things. So 2, yes, do the monitoring, get your worming under control. But if you've got a horse that you're worried about, I would spend a bit of time working that up with your veterinarian, and that's a really great time to go through your worming, do you know what I mean, your schedule and all of those things, making sure that it's good going forward. I think the third thing is understanding that the treatments and the treatment frequency that we recommend for the foals, the weanlings, and even the yearlings and 2-year-olds are quite different to what we recommend for the adult horses. Again, there's some detail in the guidelines around that, but that's because, unfortunately, the foal worms have developed resistance to one group of medications. The small strongyles that we worry about are different. So we tend to use the treatments quite differently. So again, I think foals are a very special sort of question. So get some specialist thought and advice on that. And I think, look, the egg counting one, I think we talked about this before, is finding someone in your area that can give you a good service. If it's something that you're interested in learning or developing yourself, I'd encourage that. I think the more people that are doing egg counts, the better.
The more awareness that we have of it.
Yeah. And depending on where you are, I think we used to do service for horses and for cattle and sheep as well, but look into that, because if you're set up to do egg counts in horses, you're also set up to do in sheep and vice versa. So where do you find the egg counting services?
Everywhere.
Yeah, I think probably, especially on the East Coast, I think there's more and more coming up. So, you can ask your vet or local stock feeds to see if they know of people. The other place you can look at, it's a website, and it's actually for livestock, so sheep, cattle, goats, called Wormboss. And they've got a list of accredited people that do egg counts, and some of them are...
That was Wormboss.
Wormboss. Yeah.
It is actually, it's mentioned in the guidelines here.
Yeah. And one thing that they do is they do a quality assurance system, right? So they actually send out manure samples to the laboratories with no number of eggs and check that they're on spec. So if you're thinking of, do you know what I mean, starting up an egg count and doing it for other business and doing it for other people, even if you're only doing horses, I'd really encourage you to get involved in that, okay? It's the same technique and method. And what it does, it just lets you make sure that you've got everything working well in the laboratory. So, but again, there's providers all around. So if you can't immediately find someone in your area, you might find someone that's doing it for sheep and cattle, and they could probably do them for horses they don't need any different or new equipment as well. So that's good as well. So I think they would be the main things.
No, that's been fabulous, but we will have to get you back because I know Kat's busting with 6,000. And I've got my own 6,000 questions as well.
Yes,
so, Caroline, when you've got a spare moment.
A lot of good questions about horse genetics. These are things I don't have a lot of answers. I spent a lot of time working with sheep genetics. I think there's some great questions. Yeah, liver flukes are really interesting topic. I think, look, there's just so many things. And one thing that I find interesting is the interaction between worms and immunity, but how that affects other, do you know what I mean, other things. So when the horses, we probably know less about horses and sheep, and we know less about sheep than we should know, right, is about the types of immune responses that they have differ from individuals, but it probably speaks to how they respond to other allergens or other things in their environment. So there's probably a whole question there on
there is, because my journey, what it's gone looking at behaviour, just starting with behaviour and then tracking down through the layers of what impacts. It's really, I can see now that the mothership of the horse and soundness really comes from the gut. it really affects the gut. If the gut is not being able to absorb nutrients, well, you can give it the greatest diet in the world, but it won't absorb the nutrients. The feed will go down. Then there's, a whole lot of, of other problems that can happen with it if the hindgut's not functioning well, and you've got a population that's out there that the horse is going to have like an uncomfortable gut, and then that goes down, and then that affects the fascia and the muscles and how the horse stands, and then you've got a whole lot of ramifications from that. So, super keen to probably delve into it in a little bit more detail, because it affects what I found is the mothership, and it affects it in quite a profound way. And I do think it is something that people have that can't see it like that. Like they kind of, okay, we've got to get rid of the worms. Yes, but it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. And it requires more management than just giving just a wormer.
It's really interesting. But it's also considering the horse and the context of the whole horse. And look, I'm as guilty of this and it was funny, I was just reading through the guidelines earlier, and we've got these recommendations on quarantine drenching, right? And probably that was the other thing I skipped over, Kat. But it's so what happens when you bring a new horse or horses onto your property, and so the rule would be that you'd isolate that horse, right? So you'd isolate it and you'd lock it up and you'd treat it and you'd get all the worms out. But I can't think of anything worse for probably the horse's mental state. So and it's a bit like your question about harrowing, right? So, again, harrowing is probably a great thing you do for your pastures, and you can mow and you can harrow and you can get rid of the manure and stuff. But then again, you say, oh, that's terrible for worms. And so I think worm control is about saying, we're not saying don't do it, but we're saying that that's a risky thing, right? So if you're going to harrow and you're going to let your new horse out, you've got to accept that that's a risky thing. So you probably got to have in extra monitoring. Does that make sense? You probably got to do extra things. Yeah,
it's the same with everything. End, so. Like it's a balance. And you win some, you lose some. You balance it all out to decide what's worth and what not.
So I think, I guess unfortunately, for the average punter, right? There's just so many, and again, that's worms, right? And we haven't even talked about fibre and ulcers and all of those things. Do you know what I mean? All of those things. So I think sometimes you've just got to
do the best
you can. Your horse is as healthy, as happy as you can. And I think that's probably the beauty of, fairly regular worm egg count, is just try and get ahead of any problems. And so it's a good thing. But no, it's you're right. It's none of these things, and that's why I said it's a wicked problem. None of these things exist in isolation. And we've got this concept when you've got horses which frequently have high worm egg counts, and people think that there's something wrong with the horses, and you're like, well, no, it's probably just genetics. But equally, it wouldn't surprise me is if you found out that those horses are, do you know what I mean, carrying some stress and some cortisol and, do you know what I mean, all of these things.
Or maybe didn't get to build their immunity when they were younger because they had so much worming or whatever.
A period of illness, and so they're just depleted. Their immune responses are depleted. So, I think it's, we talk about feeding, right? We say feeding is an art and a science. Parasitology is the same, right? It's the art, it's the science. So, all of these, the mathematical models and the epidemiology of the worm and But the art is actually looking at that horse or that paddock of horses. It's about knowing what you're planning to do on that paddock in 12 and 18 months' time, and it's kind of just about bringing it together. So, no, but thank you. It's always good to talk worms. So,
no, well, thank you
for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Really good.
And a big shout out to Murdoch University for their great study into parasites. Give them a call out.
Oh, yes. Well, no, Murdoch donated my time. One thing I would say is really great team at the Uni of Melbourne.
Okay.
And no, to their credit, okay, so a lot of the work that was done there was the research that underpinned that was funded. I've got to say, there's not a lot of horse research that gets done because there's not a lot of funding, but it was funded through AgriFutures, and that is through the thoroughbred industry, okay? So they pay some levies in, and so they funded that. Really great team at Uni of Melbourne who did some really cool DNA work, which really put some science to give us some confidence behind this. I won't say it because they're not a paid sponsor of you, but there was a company that brought together a panel, and to their credit, they do you know what I mean? They weren't pushing their treatments, but it was more around, sustainable control. And again, that was really great because for the first time you had different people with skills around a table. And again, colleagues at Charles Sturt Uni, there's some really great vets up there. UQ and Beasley, you should get her on. She's fantastic. But all around Australia. So I was just lucky to tag along, I've got to say. So.
We're very grateful. Very grateful for that. And thank you so much for your time, Caroline. Okay, we'll say goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.